We're so delighted that you've joined us via live stream and in person this evening for a night with Reverend Elder Dr. Nancy Wilson, where she will share some remembrances. So for those of us who are here in person, remember that when we have questions, we need to use the microphone so that the people who are viewing live can hear us. And for those of you who are live streaming, we're monitoring the chat box, and when we get to question time, we'll be happy to ask Reverend Elder Dr. Nancy Wilson for your questions so that we can provide you the answers you seek. Welcome.
Well, good evening, and it's wonderful for those of you who are here in person. I appreciate your support, and it's wonderful to talk to a live audience as well as our online friends. I think my friend Dr. Lori's joining us from Los Angeles, and hopefully other people, because today I'm going to be speaking about ministry at Founders Mcc, which when I pastored it was called MCC Los Angeles. MCC Los Angeles was the very first MCC founded by Troy Perry, October 6th, 1968. It is, of course, then the oldest MCC church. I was their sixth pastor. I followed Reverend Perry, Reverend Lee Carlton, Reverend Don Peterson, Reverend Jim Sandmeyer, and Reverend Elder Jerry and Harvey. And also Elder Larry Rodriguez, who served as worship coordinator in an interim time. I was there almost 15 years. I lived in Los Angeles for 22 years. I worked for the denomination, but then I became the pastor, senior pastor of MCC Los Angeles. It was the longest role in my career in MCC. It was the most challenging role I ever had in an urban church founded in the LA, incredibly diverse community. And it's a good thing I was a lot younger. I was 35 when I became pastor. Most of that time, we had 4 worship services on a Sunday. There was one at 9 a.m. in English, the main one at 11 a.m., a Spanish service at 1 o'clock, and a 6 p.m. evening service. I attended at least 3 out of 4 of those. Sometimes I preached many of them. For all my pastorate, AIDS dominated our world. The world of our own church community and of our wider community in Los Angeles and in our nation and world. People were sick and dying, and we discovered again, because the LA church had a history of this, of what it meant to be an activist church in our community, especially with the racial and class complexities of HIV/AIDS. During that time, that whole time, I also served as an elder in MCC, as vice moderator of MCC globally. I traveled extensively, and I leaned on an amazing group of staff and volunteers, and some of you are still around, you know who you are, and I'm always grateful for you. Today, the pastor is Reverend Keith Mozingo, an incredible preacher and pastor, and I bring greetings to him and also to my friend, their music director, Jane Siftestad. Jane was music director in her 20s when I was pastor, and then she took a break. She has a full-time teaching career, but she came back as music director and is an incredible gift to them. So I'm going to do places, people, and protest tonight. That's my kind of the way I'm organizing what I'm saying about this amazing church. So first of all, the church, of course, was founded by Troy Perry, so that gave it a certain mystique. And in the early days, it was called the mother church of MCC because, in a sense, most of the clergy, most of the policies and idea impetus came out of, this church was a fountain of leadership and people who, and many people who ended up in other MCCs started out at MCC Los Angeles, and so there was always a wide group of people who felt a connection, as I still do, to MCC. The other thing that for Suncoast folks here in Venice, Florida will be interesting is our church has really been in 2 locations in 27 years, and I think Founders MCC has probably been in over 30 locations. in 53 years. Yeah. And part of that is some of their early story of wandering and trying to find a place. And their first place they owned burned to the ground. The church, one of the church's locations we had was destroyed in the earthquake in 1994. So, you know, it's been an incredible journey. During my time of about 15 years, we were in 6 different locations. Yeah. The first place I pastored there was the Belasco Theater in downtown Los Angeles, a huge cavernous theater, and in a fairly neglected neighborhood in downtown that had seen better days, and it was the kind of thing where you really couldn't have much in the way of evening programs because your car might be broken into, and they were right next door to another gorgeous old theater that had become a porn theater. So that was very interesting in terms of placement. When I first became pastor, this huge, like I said, cavernous building, and the vice moderator, whose name was Marge Elefante, Marge told me this thing that one of the duties of the vice moderator was to light the oil burner on winters in Los Angeles. It can be very cold. And this was a huge ancient oil burner in the basement of this thing. And she said she always prayed many prayers because she was sure someday she was going to light that oil burner and it would just blow. So it was an act of faith for every vice moderator to have that job of lighting the oil burner. The second Holy Week that I was pastor there, you know, I was young and I was trying to sort of upgrade our look. You know, we had very plain little bulletins, and I went to Cokesbury Bookstore. That was famous 20, 30 years ago, and where you would get church supplies, pastors, you know. So I went early on and ordered my Palm Sunday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday bulletins. There were these beautiful bulletin covers with photographs or artwork, and you know, so I thought it was really going to class us up. We're going to really look good, and so I picked them up at Cokesbury, and I got to the church. You know, I was in the church for a couple hours. I came back out to get the bulletins, and someone had broken into my trunk and stole all of the bulletins. And I remember thinking, why? Why? Who would be stealing these bulletins? Maybe the Lutheran pastor down the street who forgot to order them. I don't think so, but you know, it was just a kind of strange thing that happened often there. And there's all this great glamour you might think about being in LA and Hollywood, and there's all of that. But Pastor Keith, I'm just telling you, it wasn't always that glamorous. I remember early my first year, someone coming, and this is under other duties as assigned to a senior pastor, which was, Pastor, I think there's a dead body in the alleyway. So that meant it was my job to walk out and go into the alleyway and see if this was indeed a dead body, which it was not, fortunately, in that moment. But it was kind of a little dicey at times in that place. So we found out that it would cost $2 million to earthquake-proof the building and another, you know, exorbitant amount for a new roof. And so we knew we had to move. And we bought a building, but it needed to be renovated. And bought a building in Culver City, a little city inside of Los Angeles, also a very part of the movie industry, the industry as they call it in Los Angeles. And so we met at a Crescent Heights Methodist Church for about a year, and that was one location. And then we moved to this building in Culver City. And the building had a kind of like you think of Rudolph Valentino and some kind of desert movie or Moroccan decor. And it was all facade, which is very true to everything in Hollywood and Los Angeles. The building had been a chicken restaurant in the 20s and 30s. It had been a roller rink, a furniture store. It had been featured in several movies, including the movie Bugsy. That was the most famous one. And of course, it was destroyed in the building in 1994 in the Northridge earthquake. Before that, it housed also had three other houses on the property, and it housed our school, Samaritan College, an office for the church, and a place called Caring for Babies with AIDS. It was the first full facility to care for children who had tested positive for HIV and who couldn't live with their families on the west coast of the United States. And they couldn't find a place, and we had a house on our property, and so we offered it to them rent-free for 2 years. And the place, there was some kind of article in a newspaper somewhere, and 2 days before it opened, our assistant pastor Danny was at the church. A car rolls up, there's a knock at the door, and Danny's there, and they thrust a baby girl into his arms. She became the first patient. People sped away, dropping off their HIV-positive baby. She survived, as did, I believe, all of the children who were cared for in that place, most of them seroconverted. But it was a wonderful part of our community. After the earthquake, we moved to a soundstage in Culver City, and I love that. One of the, of course, things were destroyed, furniture was destroyed, we didn't have a lot, but they had a backdrop from the show Home Improvement, had one that was about Christmas Eve or church, one of their stories, and so they had this stained glass thing, and so we used the backdrop from that as our church, and so there was a young woman who joined us during that time. She managed to find us at the soundstage, and of course, a couple of months we had to move and take whatever we had with us. And so as we're leaving, we of course are leaving the backdrop, and she says, "Aren't we going to take the church with us?" Realizing it was the only church she had ever known, really. We met in a synagogue, an LGBT synagogue, for about 6 weeks. We met at Plumber Park Auditorium, and we met at a junior high school. Oh my goodness. We met in their gymnasium, and we hung banners on the basketball hoops, and had to set up the church every day in that large auditorium. Finally, we bought the Gina B building in West Hollywood. It was beautiful. It had elevators. It was a very large open space on 2 floors, and we renovated that. And it was right on Santa Monica Boulevard, right, which was the parade route for the Pride Parade, and so we really felt like we were at home. And I think about that place, and one of my fondest memories, and Onetta Brooks, if you're watching, it was evening services at 6 o'clock. By 6 o'clock in the evening, we'd had 3 church services and probably done a bunch of hospital visits. And so I was really tired, but I often preached then, and it was sort of a liminal experience where, at that moment, the Spirit was kind of in charge. And it was wonderful, of course, the regulars all showed up, the people who had been there all day, and who came back for more church. But the other thing is, we had a whole other audience Sunday night, which was, LA is huge, it has a huge number of churches, all different ethnicities of all different communities. And all of those churches have a lot of closeted people in them, including a lot of closeted musicians. And so we were very blessed on Sunday nights because these amazing, fabulous musicians would just show up. And then sometimes Onetta knew them, or others of us, and they would just get up and play or sing, and sing their hearts out. And we made all kinds of new friends of people who couldn't afford to come to church in the daytime, but they could come at night, and it was a healing, powerful place, a place of refuge. And we were exhausted, but somehow our spirits lifted, and we often just floated out of there, feeling like God was up to something. Now they have a beautiful church building in the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles, and continue to have challenges, of course, but also open their building to the community. So then I think about people. Los Angeles was a place that had, you know how my most favorite character or something in Reader's Digest used to have my most, interesting, wonderful, unusual character. Well, the LA church was full of characters. And I could spend 5 hours talking about so many of those people and not exhaust it. One person I remember from my early days was a guy named Lloyd King. Lloyd was a very snappy dresser, beautiful silver hair. He was always impeccably dressed, and he almost always wore a very tasteful purple tie. He gave that tie to Nathan Meckley, who's now the pastor of MCC in Portland, Oregon. Nathan was a deacon in our church, and I'm sure Lloyd took a shine to him, but he willed him and gave him his purple tie. So Lloyd was one of these people who was very quiet in the background, but if there was ever a special need or something happening, he was very generous. And somehow he got wind that Troy and I had been invited to meet the Pope in South Carolina in about 1988. And I was probably struggling with what do I wear to this event. You know, I probably couldn't really wear a pantsuit, which was a little bit of a dilemma for me. And so Lloyd King gave me the funds to buy. I bought what Paul called my nun outfit, which was, you know, like a little calf-length long skirt, a teal colored, you know, with very, very slight heels. But thanks to Lloyd's generosity, you know, I got to wear that and give Troy many entertaining stories about me and shaving my legs for the Pope and all kinds of things. So that was Lloyd. Lloyd was one kind of person who attended MCCLA. And then there were two other people. Two women who I first met when I was candidating for the church, and they came to see me because they had heard rumors, these women, that I was a feminist, and you have to know that in the mid-70s, in the mid-80s rather, you know, still in MCC, a lot of conflict about feminism and inclusion of women and things like that. And so they came to tell me that the church didn't judge them for their past. It turns out they had both been sex workers. And so that the church shouldn't judge me for my past, having been a feminist. And their names, by the way, were Fluffy and Satin. Fluffy Isagiri and Satin Griggs. And, you know, very active, faithful members of the church. It's Black History Month. And I think about the fact that there's no Founders MCC history without the contribution of African American members to that congregation. I think of so many African Americans during my time who were in the heart of the church from my era. Everyone from Papa Jimmy Irving, who led the gospel choir, to Reverend Barbara Haynes and Evelyn Roger Owens, Pam Fairbanks, Onetta Brooks, E.T. Thomas, Jedrick Wise, Reverend Carlos Jones, Wayne Bird, Fernando Thomas, Reverend Thomas Walker, Richard Davis, Pat Beaver, Reverend Lucia Chappelle, B.B. Bell, dozens and dozens and dozens. Pastors, deacons, board members who shaped the church. And they taught me a lot. They were loving and patient with me, and sometimes impatient with me, about what it means to try to build a multicultural church that really did include everyone's culture and theology and history, that valued diversity. And I tell you, it was a daily struggle. They taught me all about what white privilege means. They loved me. They forgave me. They challenged me. You know, Reverend Barbara Haynes was and is just an amazing, gifted pastor. She's retired now, but Barbara taught me a lot about African American culture and funerals, especially. So sometimes we would do funerals for people's parents who lived in LA or family, or maybe we'd be doing a funeral and co-doing it with the pastor of the church they grew up in. It was very interesting, and I learned a lot. And one of the things Barbara Haynes taught me was that if you go to an African American funeral, if you're a pastor, then you stick around to eat afterwards. Now, in my more white culture growing up, the pastor might stay for a few minutes with that, but probably would kind of get lost a little bit and let the family and people just enjoy that time. But Barbara, I remember one time going, and she said, now Pastor, we are going to stay for the food. Number one, because I can smell that food and it's really, really good. And I don't want to miss that. But it's part of why we're here. And she was so right, you know. And you compliment the chefs, and you rave about the food, and you kind of shake your head, and you ask for a little to-go box if they have them, and take food home. And that was a part of the socializing and healing and love that was shared with food. There are so many things. Latin ministry, it was the same way. During the time I was pastor, we started a Spanish language service that still goes on today at that church that reaches people from 15, 16 countries in Latin America, new immigrants, people who are just coming out, finding their community. I think Fccla Los Angeles was the first place I met people who were in the circus. Yep. I think of Helen, who ran away at age 14 because she was being abused at home, and running away with circus was what people did who were her age. I think of Lou Carter, a great character in the church, who had been a fat lady in the circus and who had beat Minnesota Fats at pool. She was a legend. And it was Jim McGregor, who managed things for Circus Vargas. He wintered here in Sarasota, and we'd see him in the summer in Los Angeles. I think of wonderful people we had, like Dr. Gary McClelland, a great leader and teacher and deacon, who was kind of like one of our church physicians and healers, and who later died of AIDS. And I think of Dr. Lori Dick, who also became a pastor on staff, my friend and spiritual prayer partner. You know, because we had a lot of characters at the church and a lot to manage, there was a lot of drama. And so often when I left town, because people in our culture just kind of have a thing for doctors, you know, will have authority in our culture. And so she just had a calmness, a wise presence, so that when I was gone, she was in charge on Sunday, and people knew that. And I thank you, Lori, if you're watching, and how much her support and wisdom and journeying with that amazing community blessed me. Then there was Don and Lydia Nielsen. They were a mother and son, and they were extras in the movies. You know, we didn't have a lot of very big movie stars. We had a few that we had contact with, but mostly it was people in the industry, but they were extras. So Don Nielsen, his role often in movies was he is the drunk stumbling in the alleyway. He was really good at that. And so he got hired on lots and lots of movies. You can see him, the drunk stumbling in the alleyway. Lydia Nielsen, you remember the commercial, You Can't Fool Mother Nature? Yes. Well, that was Lydia Nielsen. And they were very close friends with the actress Madeline Kahn. And we're just kind of part of the whole community of people who are extras but who are connected to some of these big actors and actresses. And then one of my favorite, Mel Schamberger. Mel Schamberger came out at age 18 in Mobile, Alabama, African American, Mobile, Alabama, 18, right? So what he did was he moved to Los Angeles. And he did what a lot of younger African-American gay men did, which is he worked for wealthy people in Beverly Hills. And he worked for the actress Irene Dunn. And some of you are old enough to know who she was from. I remember Mama. And she was my mother's favorite actress. And so the first year I'm pastor, around this, next to the last week of December, Melvin would come up to me and say, "Pastor," he had an amazing way of talking. He had a wonderful sense of humor. I can't share some of the things that he said, but he was very funny. And Melvin, who was devoted to the church, he only passed a few years ago. He lived to a wonderful ripe age. But Melvin came up to me and he said, Mrs. Griffith, that's what he called her, Mrs. Griffin, that was Irene Dunn's married name. He says, her birthday is December 22nd, and she loves pink roses. Okay. So I said, "Can I have her address?" He said, "Yes." So I had a dozen really beautiful pink roses sent to Irene Dunn, And a week later, a check came in the mail for $1,000. I said, okay, there's some kind of a thing going on here. Okay, so every year, just before December 22nd, I would send a dozen pink roses, and we would get a lovely check from Irene Dunn. And so, somewhere along the line, maybe about 8 or 9 years into this, Melvin says, "Pastor, Mrs. Griffith would love for you to visit her this time." So I couldn't resist, and I have no idea if she really wanted me, but I don't know. But anyway, so, I got all ready, and I had 24 pink roses. I showed up at her door, and someone opened the door for me, and it was like a pink blizzard. Everything was pink, the carpeting, the walls, the staircase, and I was ushered up to her bedroom. She was frail at this time, and she was sitting up in her bed, all white hair, pink gown, pink bedding, everything pink. And I was so nervous, and so I have a chair, I sit down, and she was Catholic, and so I respected that. I didn't want to intrude, and I just said, we talked a little bit, and then I said, "Can I say a prayer with you?" She said, "Oh, yes, I'd love that." So I said a prayer, and so a week later, in the mail, I get a note from her, a personal note, and she said, "Oh, thank you for coming and praying with me, and Melvin loved flowers." So I don't know all those years who the flowers were really for, yeah. And then there was Robert Arthur. Robert Arthur was a child actor, known for his kind of baby face even as a young man, and he was in Easter Parade with Judy Garland. He was friends with Marilyn Monroe, and kind of ostracized for being too out in Hollywood as a young adult. And so he became an insurance salesman, and he sold Paula and me our first life insurance policy ever. He started one of the very first LGBT senior projects ever in the world for LGBT seniors. And amazing fun. I loved having lunch with him. He had more Hollywood stories about who was and who wasn't in Hollywood. And he was just amazing. Of course, LA was also a center for the erotic film industry. I met porn stars. The industry was very slow to wake up to protect its workers from AIDS. I visited many people in hospitals, did their funerals, which were often very sad affairs because the closets were very deep in those places and people were very afraid and terrified of AIDS. And so there was a lot there to have to manage and deal with and understand and have compassion. And then there was the star of Old Yeller, Disney, Tommy Kirk, who died recently. He attended Founders Mcc in the early 70s for many years. It was an enormous help to him as he was being outed in those days. He was banished from the studios, but he took refuge in his connection to MCC, who never outed him. When I saw his obituary in recent years, there was a little story about his connection to Founders MCC in the early days. I tell you, there are so many colorful and different and unusual people. There was Jack Halliburton, who I think was connected to the famous family by that name. He was a famous tennis pro and star when he was young in college. I don't know if he was ever diagnosed with a mental illness or what, but he ended up living in, a kind of flop house in Los Angeles, and had his wonderful, grocery cart that he drove all around. And he came and fell in love with MCC. And he was there every time the door opened. And he'd park his, cart out front. He loved coming to Bible study. He had very deep intellectual questions. He had challenges about being with him, and sometimes his hygiene and other issues as a result of his mental illness. But he became a member of the church, and he became a member the same day as Stephanie Green became a member. She was 10 years old, she became a junior member. And she was a precocious 10-year-old child. And I'll never forget Jack standing up there, who didn't speak publicly usually, and he'd say, "I just want to say it's the greatest honor of my life to become a member of this church the same day as Stephanie Green." And he had that kind of, we celebrated his 90th birthday. He was a challenge to us. Who knows that you might not be entertaining angels unaware, and he was clearly someone who brought us a lot. I could go on and on about people and characters, and about the faithful people who were there Sunday, every Sunday, who were there just as in our church at Suncoast MCC, people who were dedicated and devoted, who helped move us 6 times during the time I was there. Then I think about protests, in many ways, Fccla was born in protest in the late 60s, 6 months before Stonewall MCC started. And the very first demonstration Reverend Perry participated in was about a man who had been murdered at the Dover Hotel. It was a gay hotel, and he was murdered by the police. And Troy was arrested at that. And some of you heard me tell the story that for some of the board members of Fccla in 1969, that was pretty scary. Many of them were not out. And they thought that he was reckless in getting arrested. And they fired him. And so they held of course, word spread like wildfire, a huge congregational meeting after church. You can imagine hundreds of people came, and lots of stuff. And then they decided to reject the board's decision, and they fired the board. And Troy was 29 years old, so got up and said, "Now look, we're all learning. We make mistakes. And I know it's hard for people to embrace that this church has a mission that may be different from churches you've been a part of before." He said, "So I want you to reinstate all of them, be back on the board, forgive them, let's move on." And that board of directors became the first board of elders of MCC globally. And you think about that. Think about his wisdom at age 29 to make forgiveness and make it okay to have disagreements, or or make a mistake, or that it had to be okay, that we were too important to each other, and you don't want to treat people who are being in leadership and just throw them away because maybe they did something that you didn't see or understand. One of my favorite periods of time was we had started the Latin ministry, and the we had deacons in the Latin ministry, and they had their own organization, and they had their own pastor eventually, who was on our staff. And we formed a relationship with a very poor Catholic parish in downtown LA. Very poor Hispanic parish. I think they only had one priest. And he was a gay guy from Brooklyn whose partner died of AIDS. And then he was HIV positive. He gave up everything, became a Catholic priest, moved to Los Angeles, and served this very poor parish. And he was wonderful because he formed a friendship with our Latin pastor, and then he would do retreats for our Latin ministry. Of course, he spoke Spanish, and so we tried to figure out ways we could partner and do things together. And one of the things, they have the Feast of the Three Kings every year after Christmas, January 6th, Epiphany. And so members of our church would go and we'd work with the parents of kids, and we would wrap gifts for the Three Kings. Each kid in the parish, there were over 500 of them, would get gifts, and our church contributed to buying those gifts, and then we went and helped wrap them, and it was really fun. We had food, and just a wonderful experience together to do this. People from the parish, they didn't seem to care who we were. We were all just there, people trying to do things together. It was so wonderful, and it was really funny because we had to divide the gifts into boys and girls, and our folks were a little not great at that. Is this a boy's toy or a girl's toy? Well, so we had to have a little help for that. Just and then there would be the Day of the Three Kings, and 3 of our Latin deacons played the kings, and so these kids wouldn't really recognize them, wouldn't be new people, and so our 3 Latin deacons, male deacons, were up on the chancel of the church, and the kids would come up one at a time and get a gift and get a hug from the king, and I think of that as one of the most precious, powerful moments of ministry. So we decided to do something and to make a covenant between this Catholic Church and our church, and that we would be there mutually supporting each other in Christ, and that this was so important. And we drew up the covenant, and we signed it, and we each put it in the lobby of our church. And then the Catholic Church diocese got wind of it. And they told the pastor of the Catholic Church, well, you can't have a covenant with that church. They said you can have a treaty. And he said, we're not at war. We're not having a treaty. No way, what are you talking about? So we just kept our covenants up there as a protest. And then there was 1998, on our 30th anniversary. On that night, October 6th, we heard terrible news that Matthew Shepard had been beaten nearly to death and was clinging to life. At that time, we had a youth group called The Tribe. And the youth group with Reverend Dawn Wilder, who was youth pastor, we had a huge blue tarp that had been used because we had a leak in the roof. And I guess they didn't need it anymore. So they took the tarp, spread it out, and they put these big letters on it that said, "Pray for Matthew." And they put it over the front of the church on Santa Monica Boulevard, where 100,000 cars would pass through. Just pray for Matthew. Of course, he died just a couple of days later. And there was an important role for us to play. We held a memorial service on the roof of our building, full sound system. We projected onto the side of the building, which was flat. We had a ladder up to the roof as politicians, some in heels and other things, kind of came up this ladder to the top of the roof to speak against the violent hate crimes. And as we began the process of saying we need hate crimes legislation. And in the streets that night there were more than 5,000 people. Many of whom couldn't see, but they could hear. And another 5,000 or more who couldn't get there. They were stuck in traffic that night. And it made me understand in a deeper way our purpose not only in grieving for HIV and AIDS, but in confronting hate. Then we made a commitment to march on the streets every time someone was killed by a hate crime, and we did that for almost 2 years, I think, in West Hollywood. Sometimes, many times in a month. Reverend Perry and our youth minister, Reverend Dawn, actually went to Matthew Shepard's funeral in Wyoming. And there, the Westboro Baptist Church, very ugly protests were there. The Westboro Baptist Church used to go to funerals of gay people and say God hates fags and all that kind of stuff. They had these big signs. And there's a whole enormous group of people who stood in front of those signs and formed a barrier as people went into the church to the funeral. That same week, Jesse Jackson called our church. He said he was coming to Los Angeles and could he stop by and offer a prayer for our church and community. So of course, you know, this is Los Angeles, and it was Jesse Jackson. So he was just going to stop by on Tuesday, you know. So it meant we would drop everything, you know, pivot again, and we put out the word. There were standing room only, people were out into the streets, TV cameras everywhere. And I'll never forget how powerful. He was so humble and encouraging. He told us, you know, this is a long fight. This will not be your only battle. And he said, you can do it. You're strong enough to fight hate. And his support for our community was just so powerful and a great solidarity in that moment. So one of the first AIDS protests, they were trying to get the federal government to release experimental drugs to fight AIDS. Now, it used to be that the federal building in downtown Los Angeles, you could protest on the federal building and they could not remove you. In fact, Troy had done that years before and others. But they made a law because they didn't want homeless people sleeping on the steps of the federal building. So they made it against the law to protest more than a few hours, I guess. So I got a call that told me that transgender and gay activists had chained themselves to the federal building and the federal marshals had been called to remove them. So I jumped in my car, I get there, and then found myself being chained to the building along with them. I had to give the keys to my car to a deacon, and I couldn't keep my phone. I didn't know what was going to happen. I said, please call Paula, let them know what happened. So I got arrested. They cut the chain. They put my hands behind my back. It was very tight, you know, one of those plastic things, cinched it. And, you know, I had learned that, you know, you're supposed to go limp and make them drag you and all that as a protest, you know, passive resistance. And as they were trying to get me up, this very large, very butch woman who was grabbing me under my arm says, Nancy, stand up. She didn't want me to get hurt. I don't know who she was. I didn't recognize her, but she knew me. And she, I think, just carried me practically to the police car. Now, all the paddy wagons were full, so I had to go in the back of a police car, which was, you know, small and hard, and I, you know, like this, and so I'm sitting there, and my friend Wayne, who was a fearless, wild AIDS activist, he was just, you know, and he kind of made them drag him, which they did not like, of course. And so their answer was to put him on top of me, upside down. So his face was on my feet, and his legs were over my shoulder. And of course, what happened is we started to laugh. I mean, it was like so ridiculous. And he said, Reverend Nancy, I'm just so glad my face is on your feet and not on the floor of the police car. Picture is horrible. And so we rode like that through the streets of Los Angeles to the the 6th Street jail, which was not much better. It's holding cells, and we were, scorched in like sardines. So, you get one call. So I called Paula. Now, it happened that, of course, we had a date that night. And so she was not happy. And so when I said, can you pick me up? She said no. And so I was released early in the morning. I did call another friend, my friend Robbie, who took me to my car, and then I went home. And I got the silent treatment for about 4 days. It was the only time in 45 years, honest to goodness. Most of the time, Paula was a really good sport about all of this. She attended protests herself in Sacramento and many other places. But I couldn't blame her for being over it from time to time. And thank goodness that wasn't all the time. But pastoring the church that Troy Perry founded, that changed lives in history, was certainly one of the greatest honors of my life. And I still count so many friends, some who still call me pastor, loved ones at Founders Mcc. You changed my life forever, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
So, Reverend Nancy, we have 24 people online who are watching with us right now. And so I'm going to give them an opportunity to queue up any questions that they may have or any comments they want to share. If we could take any from those who are here this evening. And Marcia, if you don't mind, if you'll turn that mic on. I've been around long enough to know that.
So what's the funniest thing that ever happened during communion at Fccla?
Yeah, there's lots of different fun stories. I know one you're thinking of is with Reverend Dawn Wilder, who was the.
Oh, I love that one.
So Reverend Dawn, who was a very young, brand new clergy, and she was trying to do the consecration of communion, and she was nervous, and so she got to the point about the invitation. And if you've ever been told by a church that you weren't welcome here, and then she kind of froze, and she said, "Well, that was just wrong."
That was a lie.
That was a lie, yeah. One of my favorite was actually at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco with Reverend Robert, who was Pastor Pierce from Sarasota. He's one of the early pastors there. And it was at Jim Sandmeyer's funeral. He was one of the pastors at the LA Church and an elder. And so there were 1,000 people. Diane Feinstein was there. She was, I think, the mayor at the time. And there were, it was just full. And Robert was shorter than me. And Grace Cathedral has an altar that's very high. A very snooty kind of Episcopal church, and they were letting us use it, And so here's the juice and the bread. And Robert he's just, so nervous, and he says, he goes to bless the cup, and he realized there's nothing in it. And he's holding it, and he looks at me, and I just pretend. So he blessed an empty cup. And we decided that Jim Sandmeyer would have thought that was hysterical. Grace Cathedral, of course, is faux pas. We bless a totally empty cup, but I'm sure Jesus filled it. And so we had an Australian pastor who, Aussies are very irreverent. They are. And they just are. That's it. And you just have to know that. And he would say, when people were worried about if a communion wafer dropped on the ground, and it's very sensitive, especially people from a Catholic background and things like that. So in his Australian accent, he would say, "Look, if Jesus was smart enough to get into that wafer in the first place, he was smart enough to get out of it before it hit the floor." had many experiences of communion that were very, I think, human and that made us understand it humanly. Yes.
So Reverend Nancy, one of the people, I'm capturing all of the comments because so many are directly to you, but Roger says to ask Nancy about the beach baptism where we were wiped out by a wave.
Yeah, we did beach baptisms at the, first of all, I would bring my goddaughter to those, and she loved coming to the beach baptisms because all the men there knew all the words to the Little Mermaid songs. Roger, bless you, who's a deacon at Fccla, he's been a board member, and yeah, so, we were, in the ocean is different than doing it in the Gulf or in a pool. And so, we were all there getting ready to baptize someone, and this huge, enormous wave comes, wipes us all out, people are rescuing all of us as we're, yeah, so we all got baptized.
Pamela says, Pastor, I remember bringing Mama to our church to meet you and everyone, and I will never forget her saying to you, you saved my daughter's life. And then Debbie Cruzmark asks if you can speak about how you made it through all the loss of so many of our young men.
Yes. We did, probably in the LA church over those 15 years, we did over 300 funerals or more. We lost a percentage of our members, of course. I lost probably 150 clergy colleagues in MCC, all of whom I knew. Some of whom were close to, some of whom I just knew. I think, first of all, like the poem from Maya Angelou read Sunday, you can't do it alone. And I never felt like I was doing anything alone at the LA church. People were just there all the time. One of my favorite people, Lexi Woods, some of you remember Lexi Woods, she was the church secretary. And this family, this woman had died, I think she died of AIDS, and the family didn't have enough money to pay for her funeral, and unfortunately they took her to a funeral home that was more expensive, and they hadn't told us, and so her body's, being held hostage at the funeral home, and the family can't figure it out, and I'm trying to find help, or do I raise more money, what do I do? And it was like late on a Friday, and Lexi looked at me, and she said, Pastor, she's dead, you're alive, go home. And there were people who said those kind of things to me all the time. They weren't shy. I didn't go to hospital visits alone mostly. I went with other people. And I just have to say, people were there, and it's a praying community, and I think you just get grace. People would say they're praying for me, and I would say, don't stop, please don't stop. Because many of us live through those tough times. Yeah.
Reverend Keith is among those who are watching tonight, as are, I'm sure, so many names that you will recognize. But Annette Brooks said, I am still impressed that you remember so many names. It is what brought me to Pico Pie School. And you spoke with me and recalled my name very real. Yes. It's what many others appreciated as well.
Yeah. Onetta was one of the few survivors that we had a study of the book of Luke, and we took 2 years. Every week we met. And I think she was at almost every session. And yeah, and that's Reverend Onetta Brooks, a former member of our governing board.
I have a question. You've talked about how it was difficult there, and sometimes even dangerous. My question is sort of two parts. Did you ever really feel like your life was threatened, and sort of separately and different perhaps? Did you ever even consider giving up?
I think that there are several times in my life of ministry where my life was threatened. Actually, in LA, mostly not. That happened earlier in my life in some ways. And, you know, we occasionally had threatening phone calls or things like that, but not so much, you know. Then, you know, maybe when you're too young, you don't realize what risks you're taking, and so I might have been in more danger sometimes than I realized. But, you know, I think I had one time, okay, and the whole time I was in LA, we moved to the junior high school that had the gymnasium that was kind of, but the best thing about it was the parking lot. They had a beautiful, big parking lot, which we needed desperately because the street parking wasn't so good. So it's about the 4th week that we were there, and I pull up in my car, the first one there, and they have torn up the parking lot. They had bulldozed it. Didn't know that was going to happen. This is in the middle of AIDS, everything else, you know. And Barbara Haynes came next to me, and I'm just looking, and she looks, and she burst into tears, which was so helpful because it kind of brought me in. Because I had a thought. I said, well, no one else is here yet. I could just get in my car, and I could just keep driving, you know. And it might be days before anyone, you know, comes on, or, you know. And I did have that thought. I thought, oh God, you know, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few of them. So, that was from St. Teresa of the Little Flower. That was her saying. This is how you treat your friends, you know. So, you know, so people had to park on the street. It was even worse, you know. But, you know, Barbara went right inside and started pulling out the altar and getting things ready, and we just kind of went on. You know, I think, and when we were able to move to West Hollywood, we really felt like that was a great place for us, and you know, but we did struggle, and it took a lot of endurance some days. Yeah. Thanks.
No other questions from online so
Oh.
far. It looks like
Wait.
more locally.
Okay.
Yeah, so tell us about the one in your book where we went and visited people on Christmas Day and then went out to dinner, or to lunch.
Oh, yeah. So, tell them one about it. You know, it's like, will you sing Melancholy Baby for me? So, you know, yes, I think it was Christmas Eve or Christmas Day.
Christmas Day.
Yeah. So Christmas Day, we went out and visited, you know, people with AIDS at the hospice, and some of you heard that story about the woman who gave her that beautiful bear, plush bear, and I told that story recently, and how, you know, she burst into tears because it was a present she could give her daughter the next day, who was 6 years old, and she'd had no present for her. But then we all went to a restaurant in West Hollywood, French Marketplace. If you stay there for 48 hours, you'll see everybody. You know, that's the kind of place it is. And so we were there, and, you know, we'd had so many experiences, and so we were laughing. Marcia was with us, we were giddy, we were talking, we were excited, and just as we were kind of finishing, a guy comes up to us and says, I don't know who you people are or what you've been doing today, but you blessed me so much, your joy that you share being with one another. So, Merry Christmas, I paid for your lunch. And, you know, of course, we did tell him, actually, we were visiting people in hospice, and, you know, with the Southern Pastoral Care team, you know. And, but then Garrett, who was a deacon, said that next Sunday he got up and he was consecrating communion, and he said, you know, we had this experience in the sky, and he said, you know, Jesus did that for us, and he's paid for our dinner. And, you know, we were all the beneficiaries. So we sometimes felt like we were living in the very New Testament days of the ways in which, you know, we were taken care of and blessed.
It looks like our final question online is a request for you to share about your experiences on the day of the 1994 earthquake and on your return.
Yeah. So, Well, it was Martin Luther King Day. It was a Monday at 4:32 a.m. And Paula and I were in bed. The house shook enormously. Our living room was a flight up, and we could hear the TV, falling on the floor, and everything was just shaking tremendously. And we weren't sure is that the worst of it or the best of it, and if we were going to live through that moment. So it stopped a little bit, shaking. I don't think we could get any news yet or anything. Somehow our cell phone still works, and so one of the board members said she was going to make her way down in the dark to the church because there was no lights, And so we picked up a couple of people, and at about 6 o'clock in the morning, we ended up at the church in Culver City, and the roof was in the street. But it was 4:30 in the morning, so there were no cars there. The worst of the damage was at a mile from us at La Cienega, which means the swamp, and the 405 freeway, not the 405, it's the Santa Monica freeway. And so right near us was some of the worst of the damage. A hotel, an apartment building collapsed in the valley, many hundred people were killed, and then 110 people, I think. And somebody was killed on a freeway that collapsed. But because it was so early in the morning on a holiday, there's probably a lot of deaths avoided. But there we are standing in the middle of the street, and things are still shaking, So you don't know if it's going to get worse or better. That night, I was supposed to go to South Africa for the first time to meet with LGBT Christian groups it's right before the end of apartheid. Apartheid was going to end in 3 months. It was going to be, and I was supposed to go to a World Council of Churches meeting in South Africa and meet people who wanted to be MCC. So we stood out of a collapsing building, and Reverend Laurie and others were people trying to get stuff from inside. Shouldn't have been going inside, but they were going in. And so we're all kind of in shock. It was just, and so I'm standing with the board, and I didn't even know if I could get a flight out. I had a flight to London and then to South Africa. There were no direct flights to South Africa then because of apartheid. And so we're standing out there, and the board just looked at me and unanimously said, "Go ahead, you go, and we'll take care of things here." And so we had a brand new church sign. We had just put up. So the sign gave a location of where services would be for the next Sunday. And so that night I got on a plane with a couple of people from MCC and flew to South Africa and met amazing people there who continue to be a part of MCC today. I was there for about 2 weeks total. That was the and of course communication was difficult, and all the, so I didn't really know what was happening, but I flew in on a Saturday, and Reverend Laurie met me at the airport, said, "Here's your keys to the church complex for meeting. Here's the directions," which was the sound stage. And he said, "Here's how to get there, and I'll see you in the morning." So I drove there to this location, and that afternoon I did a funeral of somebody. Now, of course, we couldn't do the funeral at the church, so they borrowed a church, an Episcopal church in Atwater, where another MCC met, small group, and I did that funeral there that day. And it was kind of a PTSD experience. And my father had just died a month before, so this was kind of and my assistant pastor. My father and my assistant pastor died 5 days apart. And then the next month, the earthquake happened. So just picture 7 years later, fast forward 7 years, I'm at a dinner for some, community big thing. I'm sitting next to this guy, and he gets all emotional, and he said, "I can't believe I'm sitting next to you tonight, he said, and he reached for my hand, he said, 7 years ago today, you did my partner's funeral. And he said his name, and I'm thinking, I have no memory of what I don't remember what he was talking about. And then I realized, well, he probably knows who did his partner's funeral, right? And then I said it was like little pieces of stained glass that started coming together, and I started to see the room where the funeral was, and it was in that Episcopal church that day I first got back from South Africa. And so it was kind of confirmation, oh yeah, well, you know. So at the end of that year, that 1994, our staff team, we were in a borrowed room where we were meeting. And I said, the best thing I did this year was I didn't quit. And they said, me too, you know, we knew that. We knew that sometimes that was the most important thing. I think about that during the pandemic too, that sometimes the best thing we can do is not quit. And keep loving, yeah.
So I think this is the last question that we'll have.
Okay.
Jean asks if you could talk about meeting Desmond Tutu and what he said to you about MCC.
Yeah. Well, actually, there were two different times. One was in New Jersey at a National Council of Churches meeting, and Reverend Joseph Gilbert, a blessed memory, was in front of me. A group of us were there, and he saw us from MCC. And he looked and he knew who we were, he knew what MCC was, and he said, MCC, don't go away. Don't go away. And he knew that the National Council of Churches was all. And then we met him that trip to South Africa that I just mentioned. He preached at a huge Methodist church in Johannesburg 2 days after we got there. And you know, I met with him afterwards, and with Kid Cherry and some other people. And he was so wonderful and supportive, always, of LGBT inclusion. Later, Troy went to South Africa. He and Philip had dinner with Bishop Tutu and his wife, Leah, and they were always welcoming and supportive publicly and in every way. Well, thank you again, everybody.